Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference channel. My name is Jesse Day, and we're counting down to the next VRIC, January 21st and 22nd. Tickets are in the link in the description below. But for now, of course, we're bringing the conference to you with some great guests, and today is no exception. Today's guest is the author of the highly acclaimed Doomberg Substack, where he writes about energy, finance, and the economy at large. Somebody I always love talking to. It's Doomberg. Welcome back to the channel.
Jesse, great to be with you in these tumultuous times. It's pretty historic and quite frankly sad turn of events the past few days. But it is what it is, and we have to sort of acknowledge and deal with it. So looking forward to discussing all of these things with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of that, before we hit record today, you said you released an article on the Israel-Hamas conflict and how it pertains to politics in the US. So could you break that down for us?
Yeah, sure. We put out a piece this morning called Minority Report, where we talked about how the opening of what amounts to a second front from the U.S. perspective, alongside the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which is really a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia at this point, comes at a very, very, tenuous time for the U.S. domestic politics. For those that don't follow U.S. politics that closely, last week, the Speaker of the House, well, now former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, was ousted from a internal party rebellion, and that has kind of thrown the U.S. Lawmaking process, which can be difficult for outsiders to penetrate, into a lot of chaos. And we theorized or hypothesized that potentially, the domestic support for Israel is bipartisan and very strong. And I think any fair reading of the political winds in the U.S. would say that the support for the war in Ukraine is perhaps waning and some fatigue is setting in. And this is especially true amongst the sort of what the media would call the hardline right, or the fiscal conservatives who led the rebellion against Kevin McCarthy and took down his speakership. And in fact, that rebellion was precipitated by some reporting that McCarthy had cut a side deal with Biden that would have made continued funding of the war in Ukraine a little easier politically. And this apparently was a bridge too far for the small part of his caucus that ultimately led to his downfall. And in the piece, we talked about how if Israel was going to crowd out Ukraine, that has significant geopolitical consequences and significant consequences to the energy market, which is why we went down this rabbit hole in the first place. And so, in our view, it was sort of an apolitical assessment of the current U.S. political situation. But as we were discussing before we hit record, like, it's impossible to write about politics without triggering people. And we've kind of been surprised at how people have been so able to read into our piece stuff that literally isn't there because they're just reading it through their own personal political lens, which unfortunately has become so polarized. But that was a great piece and very proud of it. And we think it is truly a very, as much, we should begin by saying this is a deeply tragic event, horrific events, repulsive events, and the invasion of Gaza looks imminent. That can't but be yet another series of deeply negative events for real humans on the ground who may not be direct combatants. And it really is. Nobody could look at what's happened in the past week and feel great about it. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely agree with you. And we definitely live in very polarized times. I'm wondering if you think this conflict is part of a larger trend of a shift to an era where the US is losing its hegemony and so is leaving a power vacuum behind that is then being seized upon by countries and governments with their own agenda. Obviously, we saw the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is still ongoing. Now we have this going on. I live in Serbia, and there's been somewhat of an incident at the Kosovo-Serbia border as well. Is this a larger trend? Do you think we're going to see more of these sorts of conflicts break out because perhaps the US doesn't wield the power that it once did?
Well, the U.S. is incredibly polarized, which was the main message of our piece. And the subcontext of that being that if you're deeply polarized and you can't present a united front to the rest of the world, it's necessarily going to be that the rest of the world perceives that as weakness, which is what matters most. Whether or not the U.S. is weakening isn't as important as whether people perceive it to be. And I think the toppling of Kevin McCarthy, and let's just say it, Biden doesn't exactly project confidence and power when he speaks. And I think to many around the world, and strongmen dictators in particular, these types of things can have a disproportionate impact on their strategic planning and could cause them to do things that might not be in their best interest, or that they would otherwise do. And the risk of this conflict spreading seems very high. And it must be said that some of the things coming out of some politicians in the U.S. are really, I think, shockingly irresponsible. And Lindsey Graham talking about how we should be carpet bombing Iranian oil facilities preemptively. I just don't think these people have any idea what the consequences of the things they're saying sometimes. And so, yeah, I do think whether or not the U.S. is a waning superpower, many in the world certainly perceive it to be, and that is emboldening some of them to do things that ultimately aren't very constructive. And I think, as we wrote in the piece, an obvious winner in all of this is Russia's Putin, unfortunately, because anything that diverts attention from Ukraine necessarily weakens Ukraine. And we have seen historically when Putin feels emboldened, he tends to press his leverage, perhaps even further than a more accurate measurement of his leverage would dictate. And we saw, and we closed the piece with this rather unfortunate bombing of the underwater natural gas pipeline that connects Finland to Estonia. And whether this was done by Russia or will be blamed on Russia, there's not much of a distinction between that difference. That doesn't bode very well. If the wanton destruction of energy choke points on the international stage is normalized, that is a whole nother level of the conflict that few have really thought through the second and third order consequences of that. And so that was the gist of the piece, that nobody can deny the U.S. political situation isn't scrambled, that the scrambling of the U.S. domestic political situation will be perceived as an opportunity by some in the international community. And it would be great if we could unscramble it and present a unified front. But as you say, it's impossible for some people to read any political analysis without projecting their own personal politics onto it. And that's rather unfortunate, but it is what it is.
We're seeing energy prices rise, perhaps as a result of the conflict. Oil has risen, at least for the time being. As you mentioned, we're seeing not only the pipeline that you mentioned, we've discussed before, Nord Stream, that pipeline sabotage, which cut off natural gas from Germany and other parts of Europe. Germany seems to be on a crash course for deindustrialization. Do you think we are headed towards a full-blown energy crisis at this point in time? I know something we've also discussed before was the potential for an energy crisis in Europe. Last winter, as you've stated, it was a seasonally warm winter, and they were able to get enough natural gas reserves to make it through. Do you think that could change? And do you think more broadly, when it comes to the world in general, that we might see energy become a more expensive asset?
So now, as we ponder whether Europe will have a difficult or relatively easy time to get through the winter, we have an extra dimension to consider. So we still have the weather dimension, which, as you correctly articulated, last winter was a multi-sigma seasonally warm winter, and great. Who could be against it? But now we have to add the extra dimension about whether or not this conflict will spread. And the spreading of this conflict itself, regardless of the weather, could add to, could be the genesis of the next leg in the energy crisis. And again, we hope that the winter is warm, and we hope that the conflict doesn't spread. But as analysts who study these markets, you have to be mindful of the risks and ponder them. And I'd say Germany in particular looks to be a bit of a political powder keg. We're seeing this predictable tack to the right with the rise of the AfD in the polls, and some talk this morning that FDP might be pondering leaving the German coalition and toppling the existing traffic light coalition a little early. The people are voting their displeasure, which we predicted would happen, of course, as we like to say, on the path from abundance to starvation is riot, and that riot could either take the form of political or physical expressions, and hopefully it's more often political than physical. But we're starting to see, again, I think all eyes on Poland this weekend. Of course, you're in that neighborhood, so you would know better than most, but we've been watching the developments in Poland very closely with a big election this weekend. I think Slovakia just made a pivot to the right, and we saw the same thing in a few other countries. In fact, the AfD did quite well in some regional elections in Germany, in West Germany, which is sort of a milestone for them because the basis of their strength had been found in the East German regions before these elections. And so things are moving rapidly. And so the two-dimensional chart we're keeping an eye on is the weather, and obviously how this very, very dangerous development in the Middle East plays itself out in the coming days and weeks. And all bets are off if somebody presses the wrong button inadvertently. The markets are elevated because they're pricing in a risk premium, but I could tell you that if sophisticated Western fighter jets, regardless of where they originate, start bombing Iranian oil facilities, well, who's the number one buyer of Iranian oil today? It's China. China has a large but not infinite strategic oil reserve. Maybe they look at their reserves and say, wow, we just lost a big source of oil. We better move on Taiwan now, vis-a-vis Japan and Pearl Harbor in the 40s. Like, there's all manner of second, third, and fourth order consequences to wildly irresponsible statements like Lindsey Graham has been saying on television here in the US, that I don't know whether our leaders have enough time to look past their domestic political squabbles of the day to ponder. And that's very dangerous. And so, that's where we sit.
What's up, guys? Quick break. My name is Jay Martin. I'm the CEO of Cambridge House and the host of the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference. I wanted to quickly point your attention to a link right beneath this video where you can subscribe to our new weekly newsletter. If you want to better understand the minds of the best investors in the resource space, subscribe to this newsletter. I author it personally every Sunday, and I love writing it. Hit that link below to subscribe. All right, back to the interview.
I'd like to get your updated take on nuclear energy and uranium. This is something we always discuss when we do get together and chat. And we're seeing a bifurcation, it seems, of both powers on the geopolitical chessboard and supplies of uranium. When we look to Kazakhstan, which produces, I think, over 40% of the world's uranium, it's a really big number. They're now working with Russia's Rosatom, and they're also supplying a lot of contracts between them and China have also been locked in. So it seems like a lot of that uranium supply will be staying in the East. Meanwhile, the US sources something like 20% of its uranium production from Russia, and they have zero producing mines in any reasonable quantity at the moment. How do you see that whole situation playing out? And what are your thoughts on how nuclear energy in general is developing around the world at present?
So I would say it is undeniable that nuclear energy in general is embarking on a renaissance period where countries around the world are embracing the technology or relearning how useful this technology could be as part of your national energy suite of options. And that is, I think, secularly bullish for uranium. I think that's pretty standard, common knowledge at this point. And the price of uranium could rise from here substantially, and it wouldn't really matter to too many people. I think this talk about exports from Kazakhstan and enriched uranium from Russia, all of these are really just signposts of a relatively underdeveloped uranium market compared to the other commodities, and will drive the need to create a more developed market for uranium. And that ultimately is long-term actually bearish for uranium because as things become more efficient, prices tend to go down. That's sort of a fundamental disinflationary force of the economy. But in the near term, I think the market signals will need to go out that we need to be mining more of this domestically. And look, I mean, the U.S. military knows how to enrich uranium. Russia has a current monopoly on commercial uranium enrichment. That if the several billions of dollars that would be needed to create a domestic version of that are ultimately required, it'll get done. And so we don't view that as particularly limiting to the deployment of nuclear energy in any reasonable time frame. And of course, the time frame to develop a new nuclear plant from scratch is long enough that I'm sure we could build a bit of enrichment domestically, especially if the military decides it's in the national interest to do so. We're more interested in the long-term secular tailwinds, which I think are there and real. And just pulling up the chart of the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust, it kind of had a little bit of a blow-off move, and now it's consolidating at what looks like to be a reasonably new high, and we'll see. Yeah, we would be bullish uranium. We don't have any positions today. We're not generally, as we've grown as Doomberg, we've decided that we shouldn't have any investment positions in anything that we really write about. And uranium is one of those things, and nuclear is one of those things. And so we just cleaned our slate of it all. But that doesn't mean that if we were forced to bet, we wouldn't be betting long. And we certainly would. But again, you never know. Could go down from here and then rise again as things evolve.
We're continuing to see issues with the green energy transition. We've spoken about this before, particularly when it comes to wind energy, but a lot of the solar industry as well is funded primarily by government subsidies, and this is obviously creating massive issues. I wonder if, and again, we've talked about this before, but if the new green economy that's being promised by all of the big thinkers of the world is not going to come to pass as they think it is. And my question is on base metals, particularly copper and also silver to some extent, because these days we're hearing a big narrative about silver's use in photovoltaics and all of these things. I'm wondering if demand there might not be quite as robust as people are forecasting if we see kind of a collapse in the overall green energy space. I'm wondering what your thoughts are there. Do you think there's still value in those commodities outside of the green energy transition up ahead? Are you bullish? Are you bearish? What's your take?
I would say wind and solar are separate and should be analyzed as such, and that offshore wind in particular is in a real crisis. And I think the industry, we wrote a piece basically predicting that the offshore wind sector in particular looks set to potentially even collapse. Joe Biden has proclaimed a goal of 30 gigawatts of wind, offshore wind, by 2030, and we suspect he'll miss that goal by roughly 30 gigawatts. We don't think any is going in, and so that's different than solar. Solar makes sense in some parts of the world, but if you ask me to take the highest level view possible, both the price of copper and the price of lithium aren't really penciling in the green energy transition that is in most people's political base cases. And I think the market is telling us something very important, that it's not going to happen, that between here and there, rightward tax will occur in various decisive economies. And we wrote a piece, The Great Backpedaling is Upon Us, where we described the beginning of such cracks in the UK, Sweden, and a few other places. I think we saw that last year with Biden raiding the Strategic Petroleum Reserve ahead of the election, which, look, if you think carbon emissions are going to destroy the planet, artificially lowering the price of oil necessarily increases the amount of emissions. And he did this as a political calculation. And so don't tell me that you genuinely believe, well, put it this way, you think that your political survival is more important than the survival of the planet. Because if you think the planet is definitely going to die because of the burning of fossil fuels, the last thing you should be doing is panic releasing 1 million barrels a day from the SPR in order to win an election. So which one is it? So I think the price of copper is, because if we do a green transition where we electrify everything, there are no scenarios where copper isn't dramatically needed. The supplies of copper won't, and the demand for copper will explode beyond all ability to supply it. And we're just not seeing that in the market prices. And so I think that just tells me that the market has sniffed out what's eventually going to happen. That's our view.
Very interesting. Coal, the most hated of all commodities, well, at least one of them. Germany announcing that they're going to be refiring some of their coal capacity for the winter. On a grander scale, we've seen China and India both announce massive build-outs to their coal capacity. We're obviously being told two different tales here. One is that we're going to decarbonize, we're going to get rid of fossil fuels. You've got the Just Stop Oil protesters throwing paint at university windows. It's just embarrassing. And then they're ignoring the elephant in the room, obviously, which is developing nations who need all forms of energy. And Pakistan, obviously, another country that has shifted heavily to coal. Do you think we're going to continue to see coal use? I know you've said we're going to see oil use out into the indefinite future, as far as you can see. Do you think coal is here to stay for the long run? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we actually developed something that we call Doomberg's postulate, which states that every molecule of fossil fuels produced globally will be burned by somebody somewhere, and local restrictions merely shift who gets to enjoy that privilege. And if you look at the European Union, which is probably leading the charge against the burning of fossil fuels, they don't produce any fossil fuels. They just don't, outside of coal. And the rest of the world does. And if Indonesia mines coal, somebody's going to burn it. Period. Because to somebody, that is life-nourishing energy. And the German retreat to the coal mines did irreparable damage to the climate agenda of the G7 countries, the sort of Western elite. Because at the first sign of any panic, or any crisis, they reverted right back to coal. And so the world is no longer going to listen to what Germany says. They're just going to watch what they do and act accordingly. So we're going to see in 2023 yet another record year for the production of coal, which necessarily means we're going to see another record year for the burning of coal. China is building out coal at a rate that far surpasses the Western build out of renewables. And so, yeah, of course, we're going to burn more coal. China's stockpile. In fact, there's a concerning interpretation of the rate at which China is importing coal could imply that they're stockpiling energy for a certain military action, because their coal imports are up remarkably year over year, much more than they're burning. And their coal inventories are growing. And the nice thing about coal is it's the easiest of the fossil fuels to store. I mean, you just make a pile of it. And so, yeah, of course, we're going to use more coal. And we're going to use as much natural gas as we drill for and as much oil as we drill for. And this is where, like, if we look at what the European Union is doing, they produce, low single-digit % of the world's oil, natural gas, and coal. Now, it depends if you include Norway. Well, Norway's not in the EU, and the UK is no longer also. And so the energy producers, ironically, on the continent aren't in the EU. And so, and they will look out for themselves. When push comes to shove, the countries will look out for themselves. So Indonesia, Pakistan, South Africa, Latin America, China, India. There's like 5 billion people in the global south who live on an average of roughly 1/5 the amount of energy that we enjoy in the US. There's only 300 million people in the US. You do the math about the energy demand that's coming. And so, yeah, like it or not, unless you can stop people from producing coal, every gram of coal produced will be burned by somebody, unfortunately. And so that's why, for example, we did a deep dive for our pro tier on carbon capture and sequestration, because, if we're truly worried about emissions, then there's only a few options, and those options include nuclear and carbon capture and selective use of solar and selective use of wind where it makes sense, where you have, trade winds that are steady and predictable and so on. But yeah, I think we're seeing the walking back of all of these 2030 goals. And when we get to 2035, they'll be walking back their 2035 goals. It's just not going to happen, unfortunately.
Well, Doomberg, it's always a pleasure to converse with you. Before I let you go, could you tell us about the Doomberg Substack?
Yeah, Doomberg.substack.com. We're exclusively on the Substack ecosystem now. We've put our Twitter account on lurker mode and are focused exclusively on Notes, which is Substack's version of Twitter, which is a really great little ecosystem they're building. 100% subscriber supported, and we write things that are sometimes provocative, but we try not to be polarizing, and often funny, but not silly. And we try to teach without being self-indulgent, and those are our brand ambitions. And if you enjoyed this discussion and you want to learn more, you can head over to Doomberg.substack.com, sign up for free. You'll get a free preview for every piece that we publish. And then if one of those pieces, catches your interest, maybe we'll entice you over the wall and you can read all of our work behind the paywall. So thanks, Jesse. Wish we were meeting, during happier times. But I really appreciated the discussion today, and hope you have a wonderful weekend.
You too, Doomberg, and I will put a link in the description below to the Doomberg Substack to anybody who wants to check that out. Thank you once again, Doomberg, for joining us, and looking forward to our next conversation.